Every Sunday, in Catholic and Protestant churches across the world, Christians stand up and recite the Apostles' Creed. And somewhere in that creed, they say the words, resurrection of the body. They have been saying those words for nearly 2,000 years. And then the pastor at the same church delivers a funeral sermon telling the grieving family that their loved one is in a better place, watching over them from heaven, finally at peace, and free from suffering. But that's Plato, and definitely not the resurrection of the body. Those are two totally different claims about what death is and what comes after it. And the Apostles' Creed tradition has been making both of them simultaneously for so long that almost nobody inside it stops to ask whether they actually fit together. Well, N.T. Wright, the former Bishop of Durham and one of the most credentialed resurrection scholars working in the English language, has made this point directly, saying that most contemporary Christians do not actually believe what the creeds say. What they do believe is Platonic soul immortality, but dressed in Christian language. Again, going to heaven when you die is not the same claim as the resurrection of the body. And if you really press on the popular framework, it turns out to not have a good answer. Like, if grandma is already fully in heaven right now, then what exactly is the resurrection adding? Because these are two incompatible traditions that were never asked to reconcile with each other. In the last episode, I talked about where the original doctrine came from, what happened to it, and what it looks like when the pieces are reassembled. What I want to do in this episode is simply trace how that gap actually opened. We'll talk more about where the resurrection of the body actually comes from, why there's so little of it in the early Hebrew Bible and so much of it in later texts, what the historical pressure was that drove it into the canon, what the Hebrew framework actually said about the body, death, and what a person is before the Platonic import displaced it, and finally, how does the LDS framework sit inside that original tradition in a way that resolves problems that the Platonic version never could? Really quickly, I just want to thank all my patrons to the channel and all of my supporters behind the scenes, as well as all of you that like my videos and then talk about it in the comments. Every bit helps, and this channel wouldn't be what it is or what it's evolving into without your collective support. If you want to help support the channel, please consider donating through my Ko-Fi and PayPal that are linked in the channel description. And like this video and share it with somebody that needs some clarification on these topics. Again, thank you all. And one final note before we start, the scholars I drew on here today are working in Hebrew Bible studies, New Testament scholarship, patristics, and church history. People like John Levinson at Harvard, John Collins at Yale, Caroline Walker Bynum at Columbia, and Oscar Coleman at Basel and the Sorbonne. Most of them are working from inside Christian or Jewish academic traditions, and none of them have any institutional reason whatsoever to arrive at conclusions favorable to the LDS Restoration. And, of course, just understand that this episode is not an exhaustive treatment, because the scholarship on these questions runs considerably deeper than a single video can follow. Case in point, I made 2 episodes in a row about resurrection theology, and I used totally different sets of scholars for each. But the sources for this episode are in the pinned comment below, and I'd encourage you to go look further. What I'm offering here is simply a starting point, not a complete case. With that said, I'm Alex Arnold. This is Moroni's Standard. Why does the Old Testament seem to say almost nothing about life after death, and then suddenly it says a lot? Well, if you read the Hebrew Bible in the order that it was written, rather than the order it was assembled, you'll notice something that most Sunday school curricula try to quietly skip over. The earliest layers of the text, like the parts that scholars date to the pre-exilic period, meaning before the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 587 BC, say almost nothing coherent about what happens after death. That is mainstream academic methodology, like the documentary hypothesis and related source-critical approaches developed by non-LDS biblical scholars over the past 2 centuries, which identify distinct compositional strata within the Hebrew Bible on the basis of language, style, theology, and historical context. The scholarly consensus is that the text we have was assembled and edited over many centuries, and when you read it in that developmental sequence, it shows something that the canonical order obscures. Let's start with the Hebrew word for the realm of the dead, Sheol. It appears 65 times in the Old Testament. In the early texts, it's not a place of reward or punishment. It's simply where the dead go, like the Greek Hades, a shadowy underworld beneath the earth where the shades of the departed exist in a state of diminished, joyless non-consciousness. Not just the wicked specifically, but everyone, kings and beggars, faithful prophets, and apostates. Sheol does not check your record at the door. Everyone goes there. Psalm 115, verse 17, puts it plainly when it says, "The dead do not praise the Lord, nor do any who go down into silence." Job 14, verses 10 through 12, describes a man lying down and not rising until the heavens are no more. And Ecclesiastes states in chapter 9 that the dead know nothing, have no further reward, and their memory is forgotten. There's a scene in 1 Samuel 28 that illustrates this more vividly than almost anything else in the Bible. Saul, on the eve of battle, consults a medium and asks her to call up the shade of the prophet Samuel. But then the text doesn't present what follows as a demonic trick or a theological cautionary tale. Instead, it presents it as the actual Samuel, rising from below the earth and irritated at being disturbed. But wait, Samuel is not in heaven, he's in Sheol. So even the greatest prophet of his generation is in the underworld. And then, this is the little detail that matters, the text offers no theological correction. The narrator does not go on to say that Samuel was actually in heaven and the medium was deceived, and it doesn't say that the ghost was a demon pretending to be Samuel. It straightforwardly presents the encounter as exactly what it appears to be. That absence of correction is the biggest piece of evidence. The authors and readers understood that this is simply where the dead are, including the righteous dead, and the text assumes that no one reading it will find that surprising. John Levinson, a Jewish scholar at Harvard Divinity School, spent years documenting this same pattern in his 2006 book, Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel. His conclusion is that early Israelite religion had no robust doctrine of individual resurrection, that what it had instead was a theology of national survival and covenant continuity, and that the individual's fate after death was, for most of Israel's early history, a question that the tradition largely left open. So when does resurrection actually show up, and why then? Well, the explicit resurrection language arrives a little late. Daniel 12:2 says, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." This passage is widely dated by mainstream scholarship to approximately 165 BC, so during the Maccabean crisis. If you're unfamiliar, the Maccabean crisis was a period of intense persecution under the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who desecrated the Jerusalem temple and banned Jewish practice on pain of death. Circumcision was prohibited, Sabbath observance was prohibited, and possession of Torah scrolls was prohibited. The temple was rededicated to Zeus, and pigs were sacrificed on the altar. The people were dying specifically because of their faithfulness, and the theological problem that created was one of the early tradition had no clear answer for. If God is just and rewards the righteous, what do you say to the community watching its most faithful members executed for keeping the covenant? John Collins, a Yale scholar of Second Temple Judaism, has argued extensively that Daniel's resurrection language arose specifically in response to that crisis. If justice could not be delivered in this life, it would be delivered in the next. And the resurrection emerges in the canonical text as the answer to a theodicy problem that earlier Israelite theology had not yet been forced to confront directly. The most common conservative response to this is that Daniel is dated late only because critical scholars assume that prophecy is impossible. So let's take that one seriously. The dating of Daniel is actively contested, and some conservative scholars argue for a 6th century BC composition. But even on an early date, the argument still doesn't collapse, for two reasons. First, the pre-exilic silence in Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, the earlier Psalms, and the pre-exilic prophets is still there, regardless of when Daniel was written. Those texts say what they say. Second, there is a specific textual detail in Daniel's prophecies, where the historical detail is extraordinarily precise up through the reign of Antiochus IV, and then it immediately becomes vague, which is not typical when you compare it to books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Amos, which maintain consistent detail across near and far predictions. That abrupt drop-off is the distinctive fingerprint of someone writing in the middle of a crisis, and not someone predicting it across centuries. What is beyond reasonable dispute is that the Second Temple period, meaning the centuries surrounding the life of Jesus, produced an explosion of afterlife theology that makes the earlier Hebrew silence look like a completely different religious tradition. So, what was happening in Second Temple Judaism that made afterlife theology explode? The period between roughly 400 BC and 100 AD is what scholars call the Second Temple period. It was named for the rebuilt Jerusalem temple that stood during that time and produced an enormous amount of Jewish afterlife theology that most Christians have never encountered, largely because most of those texts did not make it into the Protestant Old Testament. Many of the books collected under the heading of the pseudepigrapha, texts like 1st Enoch, the Apocalypse of Baruch, 4th Ezra, and the Psalms of Solomon, contain highly developed and highly specific afterlife theology involving the resurrection of the body, the judgment of individual souls, multiple heavens, and differentiated degrees of reward and punishment. 1st Enoch chapter 22 in particular describes 4 differentiated compartments in the underworld where the dead are held in different conditions that correspond to their moral record, with the righteous in one place, the wicked in another, and the martyred in yet another, which is a far cry from the undifferentiated Sheol of the pre-exilic texts. So, the Dead Sea Scrolls documents found at Qumran between 1947 and 1956 confirm that at least one major Jewish sect before and during the time of Jesus held exactly this kind of structured, differentiated resurrection theology. George W. E. Nicholsburg, an American scholar of Second Temple Judaism at the University of Iowa, documented this development in his landmark work, Resurrection, Immortality, and Eternal Life in Intertestamental Judaism. His conclusion is that bodily resurrection was widespread but not universal in Second Temple Judaism, that it developed along several distinct tracks, and that the bodily resurrection Jesus proclaimed fits squarely within one of those tracks rather than representing something that his audience would have found entirely foreign. Jesus was simply taking a position in a live theological debate of the time, and the Sadducees who rejected resurrection and the Pharisees who affirmed it were the opposite poles of that debate. What distinguished Jesus' position was not that he affirmed resurrection like the Pharisees, but that he proclaimed a specific bodily resurrection of himself that his disciples could physically encounter and testify to, thereby making the claim in terms that his audience could, in principle, assess for themselves rather than a purely invisible spiritual event. And that is the Hebrew framework's endpoint. The whole person restored to embodied existence in a way that others could witness, but not the soul escaping to a spiritual realm. So, if the Jewish framework was bodily resurrection, then how did Christianity end up with immortal souls floating to heaven? In the last episode, I showed you where the Platonic soul came from and how it entered Christianity. Like the Phaedo, the 2nd century AD apologists that were the Greek-educated writers who first synthesized Christian theology with Greek philosophy, coined by von Harnack as acute Hellenization. If you haven't seen that episode yet, the short version of von Harnack is that the body is a prison, and the death is liberation framework are Plato's rather than the Bible's. And these 2nd century writers were open about that importation. They actually described themselves as synthesizing Greek philosophy with Christian revelation. So, that is the established ground for this conversation. What we're looking at here today is what happened when that framework landed inside a tradition already committed to bodily resurrection, because it wasn't at all displaced cleanly. The creeds still formally affirm the resurrection of the body. The Apostles' Creed says it, and the Nicene Creed of 325 AD says it. It never went away. But what happened instead was that the two fragments were layered on top of each other, and the tradition simply never required itself to sort out which framework was actually in charge. So you end up with a creed affirming resurrection of the body, sitting alongside a working theology that treats the body as incidental to personal identity, treats death as the soul's liberation from that same body, and then treats the period between death and resurrection as the soul already dwelling fully in heavenly bliss. I guess nobody ever thought to stand up and say that these two frameworks are incompatible and we need to choose one. Instead, they just kept affirming both and hoping that nobody read the creed and the funeral liturgy side by side. and that's pretty easy to do when most people literally couldn't even read until the 18th century. Now, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll notice that this is part of a pattern we've been tracing across multiple episodes, including the Trinity, creation ex nihilo, and the creedal formulas. Each of those, if you look at the primary sources, turns out to carry the fingerprints of Greek philosophical categories being imported rather than biblical categories being preserved. With the Trinity as a Neoplatonic substance language that was formalized at councils convened by an emperor, and creation ex nihilo as a 2nd century development that emerged through engagement with Greek philosophical debates rather than from the Hebrew text. The soul doctrine is just the same story one more time, but understanding what was displaced in this particular collision is how you can understand why the LDS position is not the innovation that the critics say it is. So, if it's in the Apostles' Creed, then didn't early Christians believe in bodily resurrection? The answer is yes, they did. And the existence of this formal creedal affirmation is precisely the problem. Because it never went away, it just stopped being operative. Caroline Walker Bynum, a historian at Columbia University, documented what the unresolved tension actually produced in her 1995 book, The Resurrection of the Body in Western Christianity. So let's look at those theological knots that followed. Medieval theologians debated things like whether a cannibal's resurrection body would include the flesh of the people he ate, since that flesh technically belonged to someone else. They also debated what happens to the body of someone who drowned and was eaten by a fish, who were then eaten by other fish. And they debated whether a body was resurrected at its peak age or its age at death, and what to do about infants. These might sound like silly examples, but these are some of the most serious thinkers in the Western intellectual tradition, and they ended up spending serious effort on these questions because the Platonic framework that they had inherited gave them no real coherent way to value the body as constitutive of who a person actually is. When your anthropology treats the body as incidental, the resurrection then becomes a puzzle with no clean solution. And you can see that puzzle working its way through 1,000 years of Christian thought in Bynum's documentation of it. There's also something to be said here about the early church's own fights, like the Gnostic heresies of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, which were largely heresies about the body. The Gnostics believed the body is evil. The material world is a corrupt creation of a lesser God, and Christ could not have had a real physical body because physical matter is beneath the divine. Of course, the early church formally rejected all of this, and yet those same church fathers were simultaneously absorbing the Platonic framework that made the Gnostic conclusions logically attractive in the first place. The connection is very direct. Both Platonism and Gnosticism treat the physical body as inferior to the soul. The difference is that Platonism says the soul is imprisoned in the body and liberated by death, and Gnosticism says that the material world is evil and the body a burden. But they share the same anthropological premise, even if they reach different conclusions. And once you accept that premise, the Gnostic endpoint actually becomes much harder to fully argue against. In the end, they won the argument against Gnosticism on paper while still adopting the anthropology that kept producing the same conclusions. The victory was structurally unstable, as they had rejected the Gnostic endpoint while keeping the premise that generated it, and many body-denying tendencies have surfaced repeatedly throughout Christian history in various forms precisely because the underlying logic was never fully removed. Like asceticism treating bodily pleasure as spiritually corrupting, the Cathar movement of medieval France explicitly teaching that the material world was the creation of an evil god, and the persistent theological anxiety about whether the body's desires could ever be innocent rather than obstacles to spiritual progress. All of these draw on the same anthropological premise that the early church formally condemned in Gnosticism, but never actually abandoned in its own working theology. So again, the tradition did not abandon the resurrection of the body. It kept affirming it formally while simultaneously building a practical theology that quietly made the resurrection almost redundant. The creed says one thing and the funeral sermon says another, and both things have been said by the same tradition for nearly 2,000 years without the contradiction ever being addressed. Okay, then if the Hebrew framework wasn't Platonic, what did it actually say about the body, death, and resurrection? Well, the reason those two things came apart, meaning the creedal affirmation and the working theology, is that the tradition lost track of what a person actually is in the Hebrew framework. A person in the Hebrew framework is not a soul simply housed in a body. It's a psychophysical unity, meaning a single integrated complete whole in which the physical and the spiritual are inseparable aspects of one person. They did not view this as two separate things that happen to occupy the same space. The Hebrew word nephesh is usually translated soul in English Bibles, but it's not meant to refer to an immaterial entity that inhabits a body. It means the living being, the whole person, animate and breathing. Genesis chapter 2 verse 7 does not say God put a soul into a body. It says, God formed a human from the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living nephesh. In the Hebrew text, the grammar is one of becoming rather than receiving. The human did not get a soul. That's not how it's being described. This is describing a single completed being. The logic follows directly from the anthropology by saying that if the body is part of what you are rather than a container you inhabit, then a disembodied state is by definition an incomplete state. So death is not a liberation, but is instead a rupture of the whole person. The person continues in some diminished form in Sheol, but they are not fully themselves without the body, being cut off from the living, from the worship of God, and from the covenant community. Resurrection, when the concept finally arrives, is not a bonus event after the real person has already made it to safety. It's the only actual solution to the problem of death, because without the body, the person is not complete. So the reason death is catastrophic is exactly because the body matters. Philip Johnson, a British evangelical scholar at Ridley Hall, Cambridge, documented the Hebrew underworld theology comprehensively in his 2002 book, Shades of Sheol, Death and Afterlife in the Old Testament. And his conclusions map very closely to what Levinson and others have found. They showed that early Israelite theology did not have a robust positive afterlife, but what it did have was centered on the whole person, and the resurrection hope that eventually developed was bodily and specific rather than spiritual and general. When I came across this framework as an atheist, years into studying ancient religion with the whole person as the soul and the body as constitutive rather than incidental, it was not what I had been taught to expect from the Bible. But it is what the Bible actually says. So how does LDS doctrine fit into this picture, and where does it resolve the tensions that the Platonic framework created? The LDS understanding of resurrection is mostly drawn from Alma chapters 40 and 41 in the Book of Mormon and from D&C sections 76 and 88 and 93. The understanding is not that the soul escapes the body and floats up to heaven. It's that the spirit and the body together are the soul, and that the resurrection is the permanent, inseparable reuniting of the two. D&C section 88 verses 15 and 16 says this: The spirit and the body are the soul of man, and the resurrection from the dead is the redemption of the soul. The body is not just something that happens, and it's not a prison. It's essential to who you are, and a spirit without a body is not yet complete, which is why we're here in the first place. D&C section 93 goes even further, saying, Spirit and element inseparably connected, receive a fullness of joy. And when separated, man cannot receive a fullness of joy. All of this to mean that the body is a requirement and not a cage. This is precisely the Hebrew framework, and it is also precisely the framework that N.T. Wright argues that the New Testament is operating on, and that most of Christianity has abandoned in practice, in favor of Platonic immortality. Wright is not LDS. He would probably not even describe himself as sympathetic to LDS conclusions, and my citing him does not mean that he would endorse the Restoration. The point is this: he's a conservative Anglican bishop and one of the most credentialed resurrection scholars alive, and his honest reading of the New Testament leads him to exactly the critique of popular Christian afterlife theology that this episode is built on. All I'm saying is that the person with the most rigorous case for the bodily resurrection is also the person most clearly documenting that mainstream Christianity has abandoned it in practice. Do with that what you will. But LDS doctrine does not merely recover the Hebrew framework. It also resolves a particular problem that the Platonic framework creates and never adequately solves. If death is the soul's liberation, then the resurrection becomes an awkward afterthought. Why would a freed soul ever want its body back? And, of course, that question does not have a good answer inside the Platonic framework, and the history of Christian theology contains a great deal of evidence of how hard people tried to find one, like Bynum's cannibal debates and fish chain problems. Basically, if the body is a prison and death is the escape, then the resurrection is actually God rearresting everyone who just got out. So, LDS doctrine resolves this by understanding that the body was never the problem. The resurrection is not a reunion of reluctant parties, but rather the completion of a person who has been left incomplete since death. You do not lose your body to become more yourself. You actually need your body to be fully yourself. This is the same original claim of the Hebrew text that was displaced by the Platonic import, but then reasserted in 1844 by a man in Nauvoo, Illinois, who didn't have academic access to the scholarship that would later confirm it. So the LDS claim is that this was a restoration through revelation from divine sources with continuity to the ancient tradition, and not an independent rediscovery of a similar idea. It was displaced rather than suppressed, a tradition that formally kept affirming one thing in its creeds while operationally building its pastoral theology on something else, until the creedal affirmation finally became a rote formula and the Platonic framework became the actual working theology. I think that kind of displacement is much harder to name and harder to reverse than outright deletion would ever have been. I will also tell you this personally, as someone who carried a ruck, lived a hard life, and spent years in contact and combat sports, the idea that the body is a cage you will be relieved to escape has still never made any intuitive sense to me. All of the different aspects of your body are not incidental to who you are. They're a part of who you are and who you become. So the doctrine that says your body is a part of your eternal identity is not the strange one, not to me anyway. The strange one is the framework that spent 2,000 years trying to explain why God would bother sending your soul to heaven just to be sent back to prison. Well, what about the degrees of glory? That seems to go well beyond anything in the Hebrew Bible. It does, but that's not really an issue. In fact, we don't hold to biblical inerrancy, so we have no issue using other things, like Doctrine and Covenants, for example, which is where we find the LDS doctrine of 3 degrees of glory described in D&C section 76. The celestial, terrestrial, and telestial kingdoms, with telestial being a term that Joseph Smith used for the lowest degree. This one is not a direct recovery of the Hebrew framework, but rather a revealed expansion of it. Joseph Smith was, by his own account, receiving revelation, and that revelation elaborated on the afterlife in ways that the Hebrew Bible simply does not. He was definitely not reconstructing ancient doctrine from academic sources. So, the honest question then becomes whether Joseph's elaboration has any structural parallels. And it does, in various texts that Joseph Smith had no meaningful access to. For example, the Second Temple Jewish literature contains significantly more afterlife complexity than the canonical text includes, like 1 Enoch's 4 differentiated compartments for the dead, which I described earlier as one example. Also, the Apocalypse of Baruch and 4 Ezra describe differentiated judgments and degrees of reward and punishment in considerable detail. And as well, Paul's reference to the third heaven in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 assumes a cosmology with multiple levels that his audience understood without any further explanation. So the structural framework that makes the degrees of glory coherent, with a differentiated, embodied, specifically organized afterlife arranged around degrees of relationship to God, actually appears in texts that existed before 1830, and that mainstream scholarship has been systematically documenting since the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery in 1947. But again, Joseph Smith did not have access to that scholarship. The full text of 1 Enoch was only partially translated into English in 1821 by Richard Lawrence, but it was a translation not widely circulated in rural New York. And the bulk of the Dead Sea Scrolls were not discovered until 1947, over a century after the Book of Mormon was published. So the structural resemblance is either coincidence or it's evidence of a common ancient source. And in LDS theological terms, that common source is the original revealed framework that Joseph Smith was just restoring rather than inventing. And again, this pattern has been consistent across every area of scholarship that I've examined on this channel. Each time, the conclusion is the same. Either Joseph Smith was extraordinarily lucky in the specific things that he got right, or the framework was real. So then, what about the New Testament passages that seem to describe the soul going directly to heaven? Today you will be with me in paradise, away from the body, at home with the Lord. The most predictable response to this entire episode will be 3 New Testament passages. Let's go one by one. The first is Luke chapter 23, verse 43. Jesus is on the cross, telling the thief beside him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is the most commonly cited proof that the soul goes immediately to a place of blessing at death. The word translated paradise, or paradisos in Greek, does not really mean the final destination of the redeemed. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that Jesus' audience would have known, paradisos is actually used to translate the Garden of Eden. And in the Jewish apocalyptic literature we looked at earlier, including 1 Enoch, paradise is a region within the intermediate state, not the final destination. When Paul uses the word in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he appears to identify it with the third heaven, mentioning both in close proximity as parallel descriptions of the same visionary experience, which in that cosmological framework is not final glory, but a level within a differentiated structure. And then there's a detail from John's gospel that's worth adding here. In John 20, verse 17, on the morning of the resurrection, Jesus explicitly tells Mary Magdalene, "I have not yet ascended to my Father." So, he is not yet ascended by the morning after the resurrection? The logical force of this is pretty straightforward. If Jesus had been in the Father's presence from the moment of death, like straight to heaven, like the framework suggests, then that statement would be literally false. Jesus would have been lying or mistaken because he would have already been there. This verse is only coherent if the intermediate state between death and resurrection is actually distinct from the Father's final presence, which is exactly the LDS framework. Our framework is also perfectly coherent with the thief on the cross, because the thief enters the spirit world, which includes a state of paradise, and that is exactly what Jesus promised him. What the verse does not require is that paradise equals the final resurrection destination or that specific conception of heaven. The second passage critics point to is 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 8, away from the body, at home with the Lord. This is Paul's shorthand for the intermediate state, but let's read it in context. In 2 Corinthians 5 verses 1 through 4, Paul is not celebrating the idea of being without a body. He's describing it as nakedness and something that he explicitly does not want. He says that he would rather be clothed, not unclothed. He wants the mortal to be swallowed up by life, not for the body to be left behind. The whole passage is about the resurrection as the destination, with the intermediate state being the best available condition before that destination is finally reached. At home with the Lord does describe a closeness to God, but Paul, in the same breath, has just told you the body matters and the resurrection is what he's actually waiting for. The third one is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16. The rich man is in torment. Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom, and both men appear conscious and located immediately after death. First of all, this is a parable. Jesus is making a point about wealth and covenant responsibility by using the popular Jewish imagery of his day to do it. Now, a critic can fairly say that Jesus was using familiar cultural imagery to illustrate a moral point without necessarily endorsing every detail as doctrinal fact. While it is a reasonable position, it still doesn't resolve the logical problems that the immediate destination reading creates. Specifically, the double judgment problem I'll get to shortly, where souls are already in their final location, and yet a bodily resurrection and final judgment are still somehow coming. Yeah, it gets worse. But the intermediate state reading avoids that problem entirely. And just remember that neither figure in the parable has been resurrected. They're not in their final destination. The imagery is drawn directly from Second Temple Jewish tradition and structurally the same framework as 1 Enoch 22, which describes the intermediate state before the resurrection and final judgment. Now, one more thing worth noting before we move on, particularly for those from Catholic or Orthodox backgrounds, those traditions are much more theologically nuanced than the popular framework I've been critiquing. Catholic theology does formally distinguish between the particular judgment at death, the intermediate state, the resurrection, and the final judgment. and Eastern Orthodoxy has its own equally sophisticated treatment. My argument is not that every single Christian theologian has held the Platonic framework uncritically. I'm saying that the popular pastoral theology has operated primarily on Platonic assumptions regardless of what the formal theology actually says. So, alternative versions and solutions do exist, but they're also not how most Christians in actual practice think about death, and Bynum's book, if you're curious, is a 1,000-year documentation of exactly that gap. So, if this developmental picture is accurate, what does it even matter for how Christians talk about death and heaven today? Well, not to repeat myself, but it means that a significant portion of what Christians say at funerals, preach from pulpits, and offer as comfort in grief is not being drawn from the Hebrew framework, from the New Testament central claim, or from the creeds that they formally affirm. It's being drawn from Plato. When a pastor says that a deceased person is in a better place, watching over their family from heaven, freed from the suffering of their body, that is the Phaedo talking. Plato's dialogue on the soul written around 360 BC, which argued that the soul is the real person, the body is prison, and death the soul's liberation from it. That is Plato's framework, not the Bible's. It's not what Paul means in 1 Corinthians when he spends an entire chapter arguing that if there is no resurrection, the entire Christian faith collapses. Paul actually says, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. And that sentence only makes theological sense if the resurrection of the body is the central claim, not as a supplement to something that the soul has already achieved on its own. And then here's where the popular framework becomes really strange when you actually press, because most people who hold to it are holding two contradicting beliefs simultaneously without noticing that they don't actually fit together. The first belief is that when you die, your soul goes immediately to heaven or hell. So, grandma's with Jesus right now. And the second belief is that at the end of time, there will be a resurrection and then a final judgment where everyone is raised and judged. Now, hold both of those at the same time and ask yourself what the resurrection is actually contributing. If grandma is already in heaven, like fully present, fully conscious, and fully with God, then what exactly happens at the resurrection? Does she get her body back? Why would she want it if her soul already made it to heaven? Is she somehow more in heaven after the resurrection than before? And what about the final judgment? Is God going to sentence people who have already been in hell for thousands of years? Did the judgment already happen, or is this a second one? In what order do these events actually occur, and what is the theological logic connecting them? Most Christians have never been asked these questions, and when they are, their actual framework turns out to not have good answers, because they are two incompatible traditions that sat next to each other for centuries without having ever been reconciled, and without anyone being asked to explain how they fit together. Oscar Cullmann, a Swiss Reformed scholar who taught at the University of Basel and Sorbonne, made exactly this argument in 1955 in a lecture delivered at Harvard Divinity School, published in 1958, as Immortality of the Soul or Resurrection of the Dead. His argument was that soul immortality and resurrection are two fundamentally different and incompatible doctrines, and that Christianity adopted Plato rather than Paul on the specific question of what death actually is. Cullmann was not a radical or a fringe figure by any means. He was a mainstream Reformed scholar, and his argument was controversial among his peers exactly because it named the displacement so clearly. Wright, who I mentioned earlier, is not the first serious non-LDS scholar to say that most of Christianity is operating on the wrong framework. He's just the latest. Again, Wright's formulation resolves every problem that the popular framework cannot. He shows that what the New Testament promises is not life after death, but life after death. There is an intermediate state, which is what LDS theology calls the spirit world, and what Paul describes as being with Christ. But that intermediate state is not the final destination. It's like the foyer. The person is not yet complete. The judgment is not yet rendered, and the resurrection means the permanent, embodied, physical restoration of the whole person to a higher order of existence. That sequence of death, intermediate state, resurrection, and the judgment is actually coherent. You can order those events. and you can explain what each one does that the previous one did not. But the popular framework cannot do that, which is exactly the problem. So why does any of this matter practically? Isn't this all just theological abstraction? It matters because the framework that you use to think about death shapes everything connected to it, like what having a body means, what suffering means, how you understand moral accountability, and whether God's justice is something that can actually be satisfied in a coherent way. Under the Platonic framework, the body is ultimately disposable, and since the real person will be freed from it at death anyway, the resurrection becomes what Bynum explained, just an ongoing theological awkwardness that the tradition never quite resolved, because the framework surrounding it kept undermining the very claim it was making. But under the Hebrew framework, which the LDS Restoration preserves and extends, the body is not disposable. It's the very means by which you exist as an eternal individual, and the suffering of the body matters because you matter as a whole person, rather than as a disembodied intellect waiting for liberation from reality. I've been around enough people who have carried real physical cost, and I've carried much of it myself, to know that a theology which treats that cost as ultimately trivial is not a theology built for the actual experience of being alive. In fact, it makes our time here pointless and obsolete. But the actual resurrection is not an awkward afterthought under our framework. It's a logical necessity. God's covenant is a promise to restore the whole person to a fullness of existence that death interrupted. It's not a promise to free souls from their bodies. The LDS framework also makes the problem of evil more tractable in a way that the Platonic alternative simply can't. If the body's a prison and death is liberation, then suffering is ultimately trivial in the grand cosmic accounting. But if the body is constitutive of personal identity and the resurrection is actually the restoration of the whole person, then suffering is tragic, but the body's redemption actually holds meaning. LDS theology holds both of those. We understand that suffering and mortality is not an illusion, and it matters in the big picture. And we understand that the resurrection is the answer to it. But what makes that structurally distinct from other Christian traditions that also affirm resurrection is that the LDS framework contains no liberation through death clause. Under the Platonic framework, death is simultaneously tragic and a release, because they believe the soul is freed from the body, which then creates an internal contradiction when you try to say suffering matters while also saying that you escape suffering at death. But in the LDS framework, death is unambiguously a rupture, and the resurrection is unambiguously necessary. The internal contradiction simply does not arise. Let's end everything today back where we started. The creeds say resurrection of the body, but the sermons say heaven. Both things have been said by the same traditions for nearly 2,000 years, and the gap between them did not open by accident. It opened because of a Greek philosophical framework that treated the soul as the real person and death as liberation, which was imported into a tradition whose own scripture had been developing toward precisely the opposite conclusion, moving toward the whole person, the inseparable unity of spirit and body, and the resurrection as the only answer to death that the Hebrew framework could produce. But the Platonic framework did not resolve that trajectory. Instead, it interrupted it. Now, none of the scholars who trace that development are LDS. None of them are defending the restoration. But what they represent is simply what happens when serious historians follow the evidence without a prior commitment to a conclusion. And in this case, what they consistently find is a Hebrew anthropology centered on the whole person, a resurrection hope theology that developed under specific historical pressures, and a Platonic displacement that the tradition formally rejected in its creeds while absorbing it in its practice. The LDS framework does not represent something introduced by Joseph Smith. It does, however, represent a recovery of the Hebrew anthropology, with the whole person as the soul, the resurrection as the restoration of that whole person, and the body as constitutive rather than incidental. The same framework that the Platonic import displaced from operative Christian theology, while the creeds continued to formally affirm it. And it extends that framework through revelation into territory that the Hebrew Bible points towards, but doesn't ever map in full. with a differentiated afterlife organized around degrees of relationship to God, the spirit world as an intermediate state rather than a final destination, and the explicit teaching that a spirit without a body cannot have a fullness of joy. For those of you who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the next time someone tells you that LDS beliefs about the resurrection and the afterlife are strange or unbiblical, you don't need to get into a fight about Joseph Smith. Just start with the text. Ask them where in the Bible death is described as the soul's liberation from the body. Ask them where Paul says that resurrection is supplementary to something that the soul has already accomplished on its own. And ask them who convened the councils that replaced the Hebrew categories with Greek ones, and on whose authority. The evidence on all those questions runs in one direction. The framework you hold is the recovery, not the innovation. For those of you who are skeptics of all the various kinds, I'm not asking you to accept the restoration on the basis of what I've presented here. And I want to be clear that this is not the complete picture. There is more evidence and more scholarship than what I've covered, and reasonable people can weigh it differently and reach different conclusions. But there is a big difference between weighing the evidence honestly and simply dismissing it in order to maintain a caricature. The argument that Joseph Smith invented a collection of novel doctrines with no ancient precedent requires you to ignore a substantial body of work by non-LDS scholars who have independently documented the ancient precedent for those doctrines. Just understand that you're not practicing healthy skepticism, that's simply motivated reasoning. If the evidence keeps pointing somewhere that you did not expect, then the intellectually honest response should be to follow it, even if you ultimately decide that it does not take you all the way to the LDS conclusion. And that's okay. But what it should not do is leave the 19th century con man narrative unscathed, because that specific narrative absolutely doesn't survive any serious engagement with what the scholarship actually shows. And for those of you who are simply curious about what Latter-day Saints actually believe, we believe that you are not a soul trapped in a body. We believe that your body is part of who you are and not a cage that you will eventually be glad to escape. We believe that death is a split or rupture of the whole person rather than a liberation, and that the spirit world is an intermediate state rather than a destination of any kind. And we believe that the resurrection, meaning the permanent, embodied, and physical restoration of the complete person, is the actual promise of the gospel. That's what the Hebrew prophets were pointing toward, what Paul was arguing for in 1 Corinthians, and what Joseph Smith taught in Nauvoo in 1844, before all of the modern scholarship that confirms the framework even existed to confirm it. And if you want to dive deeper and see for yourself, go look at the sources in the pinned comment, and remember that this is not even the complete picture. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard.